Life doesn't always give you what you want, but sometimes it gives you exactly what you need. The rain pounded against the windshield as Mark Wilson squinted through the blur of his wipers. Another 12-hour shift at the factory done, and all he wanted was to pick up his daughter from the after-school program before they charged him another late fee he couldn't afford. The past 3 years as a single dad had been a constant uphill battle, bills piling up, his ancient car threatening to quit any day, and the persistent worry that he wasn't giving 8-year-old Lily the life she deserved. That's when he saw her, a woman standing helplessly beside a sleek black Mercedes on the shoulder of the road, rain soaking through her expensive-looking coat as she stared at a flat tire. Mark's exhausted mind calculated quickly, stopping would make him later, cost him more money he didn't have, and leave him drenched and filthy for the parent-teacher conference tomorrow. But his father's words echoed in his mind: the true measure of a man isn't what he does when everyone's watching, but what he does when no one is. With a sigh, Mark pulled over. He had no idea this simple act of kindness would change everything. Mark Wilson had never planned on being a single father. At 34, his life looked nothing like he'd imagined it would. After his wife Lisa's sudden death from an undiagnosed heart condition 3 years ago, he'd been trying to keep their world from falling apart one day at a time. Their modest home in the suburbs of Philadelphia, once filled with laughter and plans for the future, now felt like a monument to what they'd lost. Photos of Lisa still hung on the walls. Mark couldn't bear to take them down. Lily needed to remember her mother's smile, her kindness, the way she'd read bedtime stories with different voices for each character. Mark worked as a line supervisor at a manufacturing plant that made automotive parts. The pay was decent, but the medical bills from Lisa's final days had left him buried in debt. Every month was a careful dance of which bill to pay and which to delay, all while trying to give Lily some semblance of normalcy. "Daddy, are we poor?" Lily had asked last week after he'd explained why they couldn't go on the school ski trip. The question had pierced his heart. "No, sweetie," he'd answered carefully. "We're just careful with our money right now." But the truth was, they were one emergency away from disaster. The check engine light in his 2010 Honda Civic had been on for weeks, and he'd been putting off the repair. His health insurance deductible was so high he avoided doctors altogether. And last month, he'd had to borrow money from his brother just to make rent after the factory had temporary layoffs. Lily was the bright spot in his life, smart, resilient, and somehow still joyful despite everything. Her teacher said she had exceptional math abilities and should be in advanced programs, but the application fees and transportation logistics felt insurmountable. Mark carried this guilt everywhere, the knowledge that he was failing to nurture his daughter's potential. As for the woman standing beside the Mercedes, Alexandra Harrington hadn't planned on getting a flat tire in the pouring rain 5 miles from her foundation's headquarters. At 42, she was used to efficiency in all things. As the CEO of Harrington Innovations and the founder of the Future Bright Foundation, her time was meticulously scheduled. Today's board meeting had run long, her driver had called in sick, and now this. Alexandra had built her tech company from the ground up, selling it 2 years ago for a sum that had made headlines. Since then, she'd focused on her foundation, which provided educational opportunities for underprivileged children. Despite her wealth, she'd remained relatively anonymous, preferring to work behind the scenes. She tried calling her assistant, her brother, and even roadside assistants, but the storm had apparently caused widespread issues, and help would be, at least 90 minutes. Alexandra rarely felt helpless. It wasn't in her nature, but standing in the rain, watching cars speed by, she felt a rare moment of vulnerability. The stretch of road where Alexandra's car sat stranded was industrial, lined with warehouses and factories on one side and a wooded area on the other. Rush hour traffic zoomed by, spraying puddles onto the shoulder where she stood. Inside his Civic, Mark debated with himself. He was already running late. The after-school program charged $1 per minute after 6 p.m., and it was 5:47 now. Changing a tire would take at least 15 minutes, even if everything went smoothly. That was $15 he didn't have. Plus, he'd be soaked through, and he had exactly one clean dress shirt left for tomorrow's meeting with Lily's teacher. Still, he couldn't drive past. His own father had been that kind of man, the one who stopped for strangers, who believed in leaving the world better than he found it. Before cancer took him 5 years ago, he'd made Mark promise to live by the same code. The rain was coming down in sheets as Mark pulled his car behind the Mercedes and flipped on his hazard lights. Grabbing the small umbrella he kept in the door pocket, he stepped out into the downpour. Alexandra had been trying to reach under the car to position the jack properly, but her tailored pantsuit and heeled boots weren't made for the task. Her normally perfect chignon had come loose, sending dark strands of hair across her face. When she saw Mark approaching, she straightened up, instantly wary. "Need some help?" Mark called over the rain, holding the umbrella in her direction though it did little against the sideways deluge. Alexandra assessed him quickly. Work clothes, tired eyes, but a kind face. Not threatening, just worn down. She'd developed good instincts for reading people. You had to when you were a woman alone with money. "I've got a flat," she said, gesturing unnecessarily to the obvious. "Roadside assistance is backed up." "I can change it for you," Mark offered, already glancing at the rear tire. "Do you have a spare?" Alexandra nodded, pointing to the trunk. "I think everything's in there. I've never actually had to use it." As Mark moved toward the trunk, his phone buzzed in his pocket. The after-school program. He winced and answered. "Mr. Wilson, it's Mrs. Patel from Sunshine After School. Just reminding you we close at 6 sharp today." "I know, I'm sorry," Mark said, the rain pounding on his umbrella. "There's been an emergency. I'll be there as soon as I can." "There's a late fee, I understand," he cut in, trying to keep frustration from his voice. "I'll pay it. Please just make sure Lily knows I'm coming." As he hung up, he noticed Alexandra watching him with a curious expression. "I'm sorry," she said. "You're clearly in a hurry. You don't have to do this." Mark shook his head. "It's fine. Let's just get this done quickly." The rain had soaked through Mark's work boots within minutes. His jeans were plastered to his legs, and despite his jacket, his shirt was getting drenched as he knelt beside the flat tire. The spare from Alexandra's trunk was pristine, clearly never used, and all the tools were neatly organized in their original packaging. Mark worked efficiently, loosening the lug nuts before jacking up the car. His hands were strong and practiced. He'd been changing his own tires since he was 16. Alexandra held the umbrella over him despite his protests, trying her best to shield him from the worst of the rain. "You've done this before," she observed as he quickly removed the flat tire. Mark gave a short laugh. "More times than I can count. My car's older than some of the kids in my daughter's class." "You have a daughter?" Alexandra asked, seeming genuinely interested. Mark nodded, mounting the spare tire. "Lily. She's 8. Smart as a whip. Currently waiting for me at after-school care, where I'm racking up late fees by the minute." He said it lightly, but Alexandra caught the tension in his voice. "I'm so sorry to delay you," she said. "I really appreciate this." Mark tightened the lug nuts in a star pattern and began lowering the car. "No problem. We all need help sometimes." When he finished, his hands were black with grime, his clothes were soaked through, and his phone showed 6:12 p.m. "Already $12 in late fees. That should get you to a garage," he said, putting the flat tire in her trunk. "But don't drive too fast on it. It's just a donut." Alexandra seemed at a loss for words. "How can I repay you?" she finally asked, reaching for her purse. Mark held up his grimy hands. "No need. Just pass it on to someone else sometime." He turned to leave. "Wait," Alexandra called. "At least take my card. My company might be able to use someone with your skills." Mark hesitated, then accepted the sleek business card she held out. In the rain, he couldn't read it clearly, so he tucked it into his pocket. "Thanks," he said. "I should really get going." "Of course," Alexandra nodded. "Thank you again. Truly." As Mark drove away, the clock on his dashboard showed 6:14 p.m. $14 in late fees, nearly 2 hours of his after-tax pay. But as he glanced in his rearview mirror at the woman standing beside her Mercedes, now safely equipped with a spare tire, he couldn't bring himself to regret stopping. When Mark finally reached Sunshine after school at 6:23 p.m., Lily was the only child left. She sat at a table coloring, her backpack already packed, while Mrs. Patel gave him a disapproving look from behind the reception desk. "I'm so sorry," Mark said, approaching the desk. "There was an emergency." "That's $23, Mrs. Patel said without preamble. "And this is the third time this month, Mr. Wilson." Mark felt his face flush as he pulled out his wallet. He had 2 20s left until payday on Friday, and it was only Tuesday. He handed one over, feeling the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. "Daddy!" Lily ran to him, wrapping her arms around his wet clothes without hesitation. "You're all soggy." "I know, Lillipad," he said, forcing cheer into his voice. "I was helping a lady with a flat tire. Like a superhero, but for cars." Lily giggled, and the sound eased some of the tension in Mark's chest. She didn't seem to notice the exchange of money or Mrs. Patel's stern expression. "Did you save the day?" she asked as they walked to the car. "I think so," Mark said. "At least someone's day." That night, after microwaved leftovers and helping Lily with her math homework, Mark sat at their small kitchen table trying to make the numbers work. The late fee had thrown off his carefully planned budget. The electric bill was already past due, and now he had to somehow stretch the remaining $20 until Friday. He emptied his pockets, setting his wet wallet and phone on the table to dry. A business card fell out, the one the woman had given him. In the harsh kitchen light, he read it for the first time. Alexandra Harrington CEO, Harrington Innovations founder, Future Bright Foundation. Below that was a phone number and email address. Mark frowned, the name tickling something in his memory. He grabbed his phone and did a quick search. His eyes widened as articles filled his screen. Alexandra Harrington had sold her tech company for over $300 million 2 years ago. She was a philanthropist who focused on educational opportunities for children from low-income families. And he'd just changed her tire in the rain. Mark laughed to himself, shaking his head. The universe had a strange sense of humor. He'd helped a millionaire know, a multimillionaire, while he couldn't even afford a $23 late fee without it throwing his entire budget into chaos. For a brief moment, he considered calling the number on the card. Maybe her company really did have a job opportunity that would pay better than the factory. But pride stopped him. He hadn't helped her for any reward, and reaching out now would feel like asking for charity. He tucked the card into a drawer and returned to his budget spreadsheet. The next morning brought a new crisis. The check engine light that had been on for weeks started flashing, and the car made an ominous grinding noise when he started it. Lily looked up in alarm from the passenger seat. "Is the car sick, Daddy?" Mark forced a smile. "Just a little under the weather. We'll get it checked out soon." But soon wasn't today. He couldn't afford to miss work, and a mechanic would cost money he didn't have. So he drove Lily to school with the dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree, praying the car would hold together until payday. When he arrived at the factory, his supervisor called him into the office. Mark's stomach dropped. He knew that look. "I'm sorry, Wilson," the man said, not quite meeting his eyes. "Orders are down, and corporate is cutting shifts. We have to reduce hours for everyone. You'll be working 4 days a week instead of 5 until further notice. 20% less income." The numbers raced through Mark's head: mortgage, utilities, groceries, Lily's after-school care, the mountain of medical debt that never seemed to shrink. It was impossible. They were barely making it on his full salary. "Is there any other position? Anything?" Mark asked, desperation edging into his voice. "I can work nights, weekends, whatever you need." The supervisor shook his head. "Everyone's getting cut. I'm sorry. It's this or layoffs." Mark nodded numbly and returned to his station. For the first time in 3 years of fighting to keep his head above water, he felt himself starting to sink. Alexandra Harrington sat in her corner office overlooking the Philadelphia skyline, absently twirling a pen between her fingers. On her desk was a stack of applications for the Future Bright Foundation's accelerated learning program, proposals from schools and community centers seeking funding for gifted children who couldn't afford specialized education, but her mind kept drifting back to the man who had stopped to help her in the rain. There had been something about him, a quiet dignity despite the obvious exhaustion in his eyes. The way he'd mentioned his daughter, the tension in his voice when he spoke of late fees. And his refusal to accept any payment for his help. "Claire," she called to her assistant through the intercom. "The man who helped me yesterday, did you run that plate number I gave you?" Claire appeared in the doorway moments later with a folder. "Yes, I have the information here. Mark Wilson, 34. Lives in Westbrook, about 20 minutes from where you had the flat. Works at Precision Auto Parts Manufacturing as a line supervisor." Alexandra took the folder, scanning the information. Something about this man intrigued her. Maybe it was the contrast between his obvious financial strain and his immediate willingness to help a stranger. "There's more," Claire added. "I took the liberty of doing a deeper background check since you were considering him for the mentorship program. He's a widower. Wife died 3 years ago, heart failure. Left him with medical debt and a mortgage. Daughter is 8 years old, attends Westbrook Elementary." Alexandra felt a twist of sympathy. "The daughter's name is Lily," she said softly. "He mentioned her." She flipped through the file, stopping when she saw Lily's school records that Claire had somehow obtained. The girl had exceptional scores on standardized tests, particularly in mathematics. Teacher notes indicated she was significantly ahead of her peers but couldn't access advanced programming due to financial and logistical constraints. This was exactly the kind of situation her foundation was designed to address. But something stopped Alexandra from simply reaching out with an offer of financial assistance. Men like Mark Wilson had pride. He'd already refused payment for changing her tire. A direct charity approach might insult him. "Claire, I want you to contact Westbrook Elementary and add them to our list of partner schools for the accelerated learning program. Make it happen quickly, I want them in the next cohort." Claire nodded, making notes. "And what about Mr. Wilson specifically?" Alexandra considered for a moment. "Send an email to the factory where he works. I want to set up a meeting with their management. Precision Auto Parts could be a good fit for our workforce development initiative." Later that afternoon, Mark was called into his supervisor's office for the second time that day. This time, however, the man was smiling. "Wilson, you're not going to believe this," he said, gesturing for Mark to sit. "I just got off the phone with the CEO of Harrington Innovations. They're looking to partner with local manufacturers for some new workforce development program, and they specifically asked about you." Mark's thoughts immediately went to the business card in his kitchen drawer. "Me? Why?" The supervisor shrugged. "No idea. But they want you to come to a meeting tomorrow at their headquarters. Paid time, of course. And..." He hesitated. "They mentioned something about a school program too. For your daughter." Mark felt a mix of confusion and suspicion. How did they know about Lily? He hadn't mentioned her on the roadside, had he? Or maybe he had. The encounter was a blur of rain and anxiety about being late. "I don't understand," he said finally. "Neither do I," his supervisor admitted. "But Harrington Innovations is huge. This could be big for the company and for you. You should go." That evening, Mark sat Lily down at the kitchen table. "Something strange happened today," he began, watching her curious expression. "Remember that lady with the flat tire I helped yesterday? Turns out she owns a big company, and she wants to meet with me tomorrow." Lily's eyes widened. "Like in the movies when someone does something nice and then gets a reward?" Mark chuckled. "I don't think it's like that, Lillipad. It's probably just a business thing. But here's the really weird part, they mentioned something about a school program for you. For me. Lily sat up straighter. Like the math program Mrs. Jenkins said I should be in. Mark felt a pang. Lily's teacher had recommended an accelerated math program months ago, but the costs and logistics had made it impossible. He hadn't realized Lily was still thinking about it. Maybe, he said carefully. But I don't want you to get too excited yet. We don't know what it is. But as Mark tucked Lily into bed that night, he couldn't help feeling a cautious spark of hope himself. What if this meeting really did lead to something good? What if there was a way for Lily to access the educational opportunities she deserved? Still, he reminded himself that life rarely worked out that neatly. The universe didn't usually reward small acts of kindness with life-changing opportunities. More likely, this was some corporate PR initiative that would amount to nothing. The next day, dressed in his one good suit that hadn't fit quite right since he'd lost weight after Lisa's death, Mark drove to the gleaming Harrington Innovations headquarters in downtown Philadelphia. His car made the grinding noise the entire way, loud enough now that he had to turn the radio up to drown it out. The lobby was intimidating, all glass and steel and important-looking people hurrying in every direction. Mark approached the reception desk, feeling distinctly out of place. "Mark Wilson," he said. "I have an appointment with." He trailed off, realizing he didn't actually know who he was meeting. The receptionist smiled. "Yes, Mr. Wilson. Ms. Harrington is expecting you. 18th floor." Mark blinked in surprise. The CEO herself? That seemed unlikely for a workforce development initiative. When the elevator doors opened on the 18th floor, Mark was not prepared for who stood waiting for him. The woman from the roadside, now impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, her dark hair perfectly arranged, looking nothing like the rain-soaked figure he'd helped. "Mr. Wilson," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Alexandra Harrington. Thank you for coming. I believe we have a lot to talk about." Alexandra led Mark to a large conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. On the table were folders, a laptop, and a pitcher of water with glasses. Mark's confusion grew with each step. Why was the CEO of a major company meeting with him personally? "Please, sit," Alexandra said, gesturing to a chair. "First, I want to thank you again for your help the other day. Not many people would stop in that rain." Mark shifted uncomfortably. "Anyone would have done the same." Alexandra smiled. "You and I both know that's not true. I watched 27 cars drive past before you stopped." She leaned forward. "But that's not why I asked you here today." She opened one of the folders, removing a document with the Future Bright Foundation logo at the top. "My foundation works with gifted children from underprivileged backgrounds. We provide educational opportunities they wouldn't otherwise have access to. Your daughter, Lily, has been identified as exactly the type of student we're looking for." Mark stiffened. "How do you know about my daughter?" Alexandra had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "After you helped me, I was curious about the man who stopped when no one else would. I had my assistant gather some information. Perhaps that was an invasion of privacy, and for that, I apologize. But what I discovered was that your daughter is scoring in the 99th percentile in mathematics, yet has no access to advanced programming." She slid the document toward him. "This is an invitation for Lily to join our accelerated learning program. All expenses paid, transportation, materials, everything. The program runs after school and on weekends at our education center downtown." Mark stared at the paper, his thoughts racing. It was exactly what Lily needed, what her teacher had recommended, what he hadn't been able to provide. But it felt wrong somehow, like charity he hadn't asked for, hadn't earned. "Why?" he asked simply. Alexandra met his gaze directly. "Because your daughter deserves the opportunity. Because my foundation exists to find children exactly like her. And yes," she added, seeming to read his thoughts, "because you showed kindness to a stranger with no expectation of reward. Consider it karma if you like." Before Mark could respond, she opened another folder. There's more. Precision auto parts manufacturing is struggling, their orders are down, and they're cutting hours. Mark stared at her. How could you possibly know that? I make it my business to know things, Alexandra said with a small smile. And I'm proposing a solution. My company is developing new technology for electric vehicles. We need manufacturing partners with expertise in auto parts. I'm offering Precision a contract that would not only prevent the reduction in hours but potentially create new positions. She slid another document across the table. And I'd like you to lead the project from the Precision side. It would mean a promotion, a significant salary increase, and training in new technologies that will be invaluable as the industry changes. Mark felt overwhelmed. This was too much, too coincidental, too perfect. Ms. Harrington, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I can't accept charity because I changed a tire. Alexandra's expression softened. Mark, may I call you Mark? This isn't charity. The program for Lily exists already, she's exactly the kind of student we look for. And Precision Auto Parts was on our list of potential partners before I ever met you. Your kindness may have accelerated the timeline, but these opportunities would have existed regardless. She paused, then added more quietly, when my parents died, I was 12. We had no money, and I was on track to enter foster care. A teacher recognized my potential and connected me with a scholarship program that changed everything. I'm not offering you charity, I'm paying forward what was once given to me. Mark looked down at the documents, then back at Alexandra. I don't know what to say. Say you'll consider it, she replied. Take the documents home, read them carefully. Talk to Lily about the program. This isn't a decision you need to make today. As Mark drove home, his car still making that worrying noise, his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Could he trust this sudden change of fortune? Was it really as straightforward as Alexandra made it seem? Or was there some catch he couldn't yet see? When he walked through the front door, Lily ran to greet him, her face eager. How was the meeting? Did you meet the tire lady? Is she really a millionaire? Mark knelt down to her level. Yes, I met her. And it turns out she runs a special program for kids who are really good at math. Kids like you. Lily's eyes grew wide. For me? Really? Looking at his daughter's hopeful face, Mark felt the last of his resistance crumbling. Maybe this was all too good to be true. Maybe there was a catch he couldn't see yet. But how could he deny Lily this opportunity out of pride or suspicion? Really, he said, hugging her tight. And I think we should give it a try. 6 months later, Mark stood in the doorway of the classroom at the Future Bright Foundation's Education Center, watching as Lily worked with a group of equally gifted children on a complex robotics project. Her face was animated, confident in a way he'd never seen before as she explained her mathematical approach to the problem. His new position at Precision had turned out to be everything Alexandra had promised: challenging, better paying, with hours that allowed him to be home when Lily returned from her advanced programs. The partnership with Harrington Innovations had not only saved jobs at the factory but created dozens of new ones as they began manufacturing components for electric vehicles. The check engine light in his car was fixed along with everything else that had been wrong with it. The medical bills were on a manageable payment plan now. For the first time in 3 years, Mark was building savings instead of accumulating debt. She's thriving, a voice said beside him. Mark turned to see Alexandra, who often stopped by the education center to check on the programs. She is, Mark agreed. I don't know how to thank you. Alexandra shook her head. You already did by stopping to help a stranger in the rain when you had every reason not to. She nodded toward the classroom. Besides, the world needs Lily's mind. One day, she might solve problems we don't even know exist yet. Mark watched as his daughter animatedly explained a concept to one of her peers, her hands moving with enthusiasm, completely in her element. You know, Alexandra said thoughtfully, we're expanding the foundation next year. Opening centers in other cities. I could use someone who understands both the technical side and the human side, someone who knows what it's like to be a parent trying to give their child every opportunity despite obstacles. Mark looked at her in surprise. Are you offering me a job? Alexandra smiled. I'm suggesting a possibility. Something to consider. She handed him a business card different from the one she'd given him that rainy day. No pressure. Think about it. As he took the card, Mark reflected on how completely his life had changed in just 6 months, all because he'd stopped to help someone in need, even when it cost him something to do so. 1 year to the day after Mark had changed Alexandra's tire in the pouring rain, he stood at a podium addressing the first graduating class of the Future Bright Foundation's intensive summer program. Among them was Lily, now confidently pursuing advanced mathematics and engineering with dreams of MIT in her future. Sometimes the smallest actions reveal our true character, Mark told the gathered students and parents. And sometimes those actions open doors we never imagined existed. He glanced at Alexandra, now his colleague and friend, sitting in the front row. Her foundation had expanded to 3 cities, with Mark overseeing the Philadelphia operations while continuing to mentor workers at Precision in the new technologies they were implementing. The measure of our lives is not in what we accumulate, he continued, but in what we give. In who we help. In how we make the world better than we found it. Later, as families celebrated with cake and photos, Lily hugged her father tight. Dad, do you think Mom would be proud of us? Mark looked around at all they had accomplished, at the lives being changed, at his daughter's bright future. Yes, he said softly. She would be so proud.